She fled a wedding she never wanted, running from chains disguised as vows, until a silent gunslinger offered his hand and a horse, with just 4 words: "Ride with me instead." But is he her path to freedom, or a darker destiny she can't escape? The church bells tolled like iron hammers, their echo bouncing off the dusty buildings of Hollow Creek. Inside the small chapel, Eleanor Whitfield's hands trembled beneath the lace veil. Every step she took down that aisle felt like a step toward a prison she could never escape. Her father's grip was firm on her arm, guiding her toward a man she did not love. Bartholomew Kane, wealthy land baron, twice her age, and crueler than the sun-scorched desert. His thin smile stretched as though he'd already won. Eleanor's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Not in the stifling heat of the church, not beneath Kane's calculating gaze. The preacher's voice blurred into meaningless hums as the words "to have" and "to hold" hung in the air. Her heart pounded, louder than the bells, louder than anything. Then, without thinking, she tore her arm free. Gasps filled the chapel as her skirts whipped around her legs. Eleanor ran. Out the doors, into the sunlight, across the churchyard as Kane shouted her name with venom. The desert wind met her like a blessing, hot and wild. She lifted her skirts and didn't look back. The voices behind her grew faint. By the time she reached the edge of town, the only sound was her labored breathing and the pounding of her boots against the dry earth. Eleanor didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away from the vows, from Kane, from her father's betrayal in selling her hand for land and cattle. She clutched the small satchel she'd hidden beneath her gown. Inside, a water flask, a knife, and the crumpled map she had stolen from her brother's desk. She stumbled onto the open trail, the horizon stretching endless and merciless. Heat shimmered across the land, blurring the mountains in the distance. She pressed forward until her lungs burned and her throat felt like sand. The town was a speck behind her when she finally dropped to her knees, dust clinging to her dress. That's when she saw him. A rider approaching slowly, the sun at his back. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but his presence filled the vast emptiness around her. The horse beneath him was black as night, its stride steady, unhurried. Eleanor's breath caught. She should have been afraid any stranger could mean danger, but something in the way he carried himself, quiet and certain, rooted her in place. The rider stopped a few feet away. He didn't speak. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, studied her as though weighing the whole of her soul. A rifle rested across his saddle, but his hand never reached for it. Eleanor swallowed, her voice breaking. "Please, don't take me back." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice low and steady, the rider finally spoke. "Ride with me instead. If you've ever seen a life change in a single breath, wait until you see what happens when she takes his hand." Eleanor hesitated, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The stranger's offer lingered in the hot air, as if the desert itself waited for her answer. His hand rested lightly on the reins, his shoulders relaxed, but there was an unspoken gravity about him, as though the land obeyed his silence. She stood, dust clinging to her skirts, and forced her trembling legs to move. "Where would we go?" she asked, though she already knew she had no choice. Alone, she would wither beneath the sun, or be dragged back to Kane. With him, whoever he was, she had a chance. The man shifted slightly in the saddle and extended a gloved hand. His eyes, pale gray beneath the shadow of his brim, held no pity, only certainty. Eleanor's fingers brushed his, and for the first time since she had fled the chapel, she felt a thread of strength steady her. He pulled her up behind him as if she weighed nothing. The horse adjusted, snorting once, and then they were moving, steady hoofbeats pounding against the earth, carrying her farther from the life she had been forced into. The town shrank into nothing behind them. For a time, neither spoke. The wind tugged at her veil, until it flew free, carried into the open sky like a scrap of surrender. Eleanor clung to the rider, her cheek pressed against the worn leather of his coat. Every muscle in his body moved with control, steady and sure, like a man who had long lived with danger. Finally, she found her voice. "You don't even know my name." He did not glance back, but she saw the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Don't need to," he said quietly. His voice was like gravel smoothed by years of silence, rarely used but firm when spoken. "I'm Eleanor," she whispered, as if telling him gave her existence meaning again. "Eleanor Whitfield." He gave a small nod. "Call me Colt." The name fit him sharp, dangerous, yet precise. She wanted to ask more, but his silence pressed around them like a shield. She realized it was not rudeness, but a habit. He was a man of few words, perhaps none at all when they weren't needed. The trail wound into a canyon, red stone rising on either side. Shade cooled her burning skin. Colt guided the horse with ease, his eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. Eleanor noticed the way his hand hovered near the revolver at his side, casual but ready. Whoever he was, he carried danger with him and knew how to meet it. As the sun began to dip, Colt drew the horse to a stop near a trickle of water pooled at the canyon's edge. He dismounted first, then offered her his hand once more. She slid down, unsteady on her feet, and he steadied her without a word. "You'll be safe here tonight," he said simply. Safe. The word felt foreign, almost fragile, but as she looked at him, the silent gunslinger who had chosen to help her, Eleanor allowed herself to believe it might be true. The canyon walls blushed red beneath the dying light of dusk, and Eleanor felt the ache of her flight settle deep into her bones. Colt had built a small fire from dry brush, its glow flickering against the stone. He worked with efficient silence, unsaddling his horse, checking the rifle, laying out a canteen and strips of dried meat. Every movement was precise, practiced. Eleanor sat nearby, her back against the canyon wall, her dress torn and stained with dust. She had not spoken since he had promised her safety. Words seemed fragile compared to the quiet certainty in his presence. But as the firelight warmed her chilled skin, the silence pressed heavy. "You saved me," she said at last, her voice low. "But you don't even know why I was running." Colt glanced at her across the flames, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "Didn't need to know. I saw the way you looked back." She lowered her gaze. "I was about to be married. To a man I did not choose. He's powerful, cruel. My father sold me to him like livestock." Her words cracked, but Colt gave no sign of judgment. He simply listened. For the first time in days, someone let her speak without interruption, without telling her what she owed. Finally, Colt said, "Kane." The name burned her ears. "You know him?" Colt nodded once. "Land baron. Owns half the county. Likes to take what isn't his." His tone carried no surprise, only recognition. Eleanor shivered. "He'll come after me." Colt leaned back, one hand resting loosely on his revolver. "Let him try." The words, quiet as they were, struck harder than any vow of protection she had ever heard. Colt did not boast, did not raise his voice. He simply stated it as fact. For the first time since she had fled, Eleanor felt her heart ease. They ate in silence. The dried meat was tough, but hunger left her grateful. Colt offered his canteen, and she drank deeply, water running down her throat like mercy. When the fire burned lower, Eleanor dared to study him more closely. His face was angular, shadowed by his hat, the faint stubble on his jaw speaking of long days on the trail. His coat bore the wear of a man who had seen too many storms. He looked younger than she expected, perhaps 30, but older in the eyes, carrying weight she could not name. "Why help me?" she asked softly. Colt's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "Because no one helped me when I needed it." The words settled heavy, spoken without flourish, yet they revealed more than she expected. He was a man forged by silence, carrying his own scars. The desert night deepened, stars spilling across the black sky. Eleanor lay down near the fire, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep. But before her eyes closed, she heard Colt shift nearby, keeping watch with his revolver across his knees. And for the first time in years, Eleanor slept without fear. The morning sun crept over the canyon rim, painting the rocks gold. Eleanor stirred, the cool air brushing her face. For a moment she forgot where she was, until the sound of Colt saddling his horse brought her back to reality. The fire was nothing but ash, and the world felt sharper in the morning silence. Colt moved with the same quiet discipline as the night before. He checked his rifle, tightened the straps on the saddle, and scanned the canyon's entrance. Even without words, he radiated a sense of urgency. Eleanor rose slowly, brushing dust from her tattered skirts. "We're leaving already?" "Safer that way," Colt replied, his voice low but sure. "Kane's men will be looking." The reminder sent a shiver down her spine. Kane wouldn't rest until he found her. The thought of being dragged back to that church, to his iron grip, made her throat tighten. She forced herself to walk toward Colt, unwilling to let fear root her in place. They rode together into the open desert, the sun climbing higher. Hours passed with only the sound of hooves striking hard earth. Eleanor found herself wondering about the man whose silence seemed heavier than the desert itself. She wanted to know who he was, why he had spoken up for her when he didn't have to. Finally she asked, "Why do they call you Colt?" He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Same reason most folks get a name like that. I was fast. Once." The word once clung to her ears. There was a story hidden behind it, one he did not share easily. She dared to press further. "Were you a lawman?" Colt's jaw tightened. "No." The answer was short, but it carried weight. She decided not to push more, though curiosity burned in her chest. Instead, she let the silence stretch, learning that his quiet was not emptiness but choice. By midday, they reached a small outpost nestled near a cluster of cottonwoods. A single cabin stood beside a well, abandoned but sturdy. Colt dismounted and scanned the area with the precision of a man who had been hunted before. Satisfied, he nodded toward the door. "You can rest here. I'll check the trail." Eleanor stepped inside, dust swirling as she crossed the threshold. The cabin smelled of dry wood and old smoke. Sunlight slanted through the cracks, revealing a table, a rusted lantern, and a bed frame with no mattress. It was no home, but it felt like a sanctuary. When Colt returned, he set down a sack of supplies he had pulled from his saddlebags. Bread, jerky, and a tin of beans, meager but sustaining. Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected gratitude. As they shared the food, she dared to ask, "You said no one helped you when you needed it. What happened to you?" Colt's eyes darkened, his voice low. "I trusted the wrong man. Lost everything." The words were few, but they landed like bullets. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but she recognized the raw edge in his tone. For now, she stayed quiet, letting him hold his silence. Outside, a hawk circled high. Somewhere in the distance, the desert carried the echo of horses too many to be chance. Kane's men were drawing closer. The sound reached them first distant, rhythmic, too heavy to be one horse alone. Eleanor froze, her hand clutching the rough edge of the cabin door frame. Colt was already moving. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon with the focus of a man who had lived too long in the company of danger. "They've found us," Eleanor whispered, her throat tightening. Colt didn't answer right away. He watched the dust cloud forming beyond the cottonwoods, 4 riders fast approaching. His stance didn't falter, but Eleanor saw his jaw tense. At last he said, "Stay inside. Keep low." Fear flared in her chest. "What will you do?" "What I always do." His tone was steady, but it carried the finality of a man ready to fight. Eleanor ducked behind the cabin wall, heart pounding as the riders closed in. She caught glimpses of them through the cracks in the wood. Kane's men, their coats marked with the insignia of his ranch. Rough, armed, and hungry for blood. The leader, a scar-faced man with a sneer carved permanently onto his lips, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from the cabin. "We know she's here, Colt," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cain wants his bride back. Best step aside." Colt stood in the open, rifle cradled loosely in his arms. He didn't raise his voice. "She ain't his, not now, not ever." The words struck Eleanor like a lightning bolt. Colt hadn't just offered her protection, he had declared it, plain and undeniable. Scarface spat into the dirt. "You gonna make this hard, Gunslinger? Cain pays good for loyalty." Colt's eyes narrowed, his silence stretching longer than the desert heat. Then, with deadly calm, he spoke. "I don't take Cain's coin, and you don't leave with her." The tension snapped like a drawn bowstring. One rider spurred his horse forward, pistol raised. Colt's rifle barked once, the echo slamming off the canyon walls. The man tumbled from the saddle before he could fire. Chaos erupted. The other riders drew weapons, circling. Colt moved like a shadow, shifting his aim with precision. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, trembling. The gunfire sharp in her ears. Dust churned. Horses screamed. Men shouted, but Colt's rifle spoke louder. In minutes, 2 men lay sprawled in the dirt, and the third turned his horse hard, galloping back the way they'd come. Scarface cursed, but even he wasn't fool enough to stay. He wheeled around, spitting threats over his shoulder. "This ain't over, Colt. Cain will bring the whole damn county if he has to." Silence fell as their hoofbeats faded. Colt lowered his rifle, breathing steady, as if he hadn't just faced down death. He glanced toward the cabin, and Eleanor stepped out, her knees weak but her gaze fixed on him. You saved me again," she said, her voice raw. Colt holstered his rifle, his expression unreadable. "No, I just bought us time." Eleanor swallowed hard, realizing the truth. Cain wouldn't stop. This was only the beginning. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence felt different, charged, heavy, the kind that followed violence. Eleanor sat at the rickety table, her hands trembling as she tore a strip of bread, though her stomach had no appetite. Outside, Colt was tending to his horse, moving with his usual precision, but even she could sense the storm brewing inside him. When he came back in, he set his rifle against the wall and poured water into a tin cup. Eleanor studied his face, searching for cracks in his calm. "They'll come back," she said softly. He took a drink, then nodded. "They will. Cain won't take humiliation lightly. Men like him, they only understand power." Her pulse quickened. "Then we can't stay here. He'll bring more." Colt leaned against the wall, his gray eyes fixed on her. "Running only works so long. Cain's reach stretches farther than you think." The truth of it stung. She wanted to believe she could keep fleeing until she found peace. But deep down she knew so long as Cain wanted her, nowhere was safe. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice nearly breaking. Colt's gaze hardened. "We make a choice. Keep running, or stand." The word stand lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor looked down at her dust-stained gown, at the life she'd been forced into. She had run because she was desperate, but could she summon the courage to fight? She wasn't sure. Yet, when her eyes lifted to Colt, she saw a man who had already chosen. "You've fought men like Cain before," she said, "haven't you?" His silence stretched, but then he spoke, voice low. "I've fought men worse, and I lost too much because of it." His eyes darkened, a shadow crossing his face. "But I won't watch another innocent get dragged into chains." Her breath caught. In his words, she heard not just protection, but conviction, an oath forged from scars she could not yet see. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying grit across the cabin floor. Eleanor stood, steadying herself. "Then I'll stand too. I won't go back. Not alive." Colt's jaw flexed. the faintest flicker of something like respect in his gaze. He stepped closer, his presence grounding her. If you're set on it, then you'll need more than courage. You'll need to fight smart. Kane's men are ruthless, but they're not invincible. He placed a revolver on the table, its metal worn smooth with age. Eleanor stared at it, fearful and resolved to warring inside her. She had never fired a gun, but the thought of Kane's hands on her again made her fingers itch toward the weapon. Colt's voice broke the silence. "It's your choice, Eleanor. Freedom always is." The desert night fell fast, stars pricking the dark. Inside the cabin, Eleanor wrapped her hand around the revolver's grip. For the first time, she felt not like prey but like someone with a chance to fight back. And beside her, Colt's quiet strength promised she wouldn't fight alone. Morning broke with a brittle silence. Eleanor practiced with the revolver under Colt's instruction, her fingers unsteady but her will unshaken. Each shot cracked against the canyon walls, echoing like thunder. She flinched less with each pull of the trigger, determination slowly carving out the fear inside her. Colt corrected her stance with a few words, his hand steadying hers only when necessary. He didn't coddle her, he expected her to rise to the moment. And she did, though sweat soaked her brow, and her arms ached from the effort. By midday, the lessons were cut short. Colt stiffened, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Eleanor followed his line of sight, and her stomach dropped. A column of riders moved across the open desert, dust rising behind them like smoke. At their head rode Bartholomew Kane himself. Even at a distance, his presence was unmistakable. His frame was broad, his suit too fine for the wilderness, his hat tipped back, as though he were surveying land he already owned. And in his eyes, sharp, cold, visible even from afar, was the certainty of a man who had never heard no. Colt's voice was low. "He brought more men than I figured." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She counted at least a dozen. "What do we do?" Colt checked his rifle. "We don't run. They'd chase us down easily. We use the canyon. Force them into a choke point." Her pulse raced, but she nodded. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. Colt handed her a box of cartridges. "Stay sharp, stay low. Don't shoot unless you mean it." The riders approached with deliberate calm, stopping just outside rifle range. Kane dismounted, dusting off his coat as though he were stepping into his parlor rather than enemy ground. His men spread out, surrounding the cabin at a careful distance. Kane called out, his voice booming, "Eleanor, you've had your fun, girl. Time to come back where you belong." Eleanor stepped forward, revolver clutched in her trembling hand. "I don't belong to you." Her voice cracked, but it carried across the canyon. Kane's expression hardened. "Your father made an agreement. I paid dearly for it. You're mine by right." Colt stepped into view then, rifle leveled across his arm. His words came like stone. "Not anymore." The men shifted uneasily. Everyone in Hollow Creek had heard of the silent rider, the gunslinger, who rarely spoke but never missed when it mattered. And now he had spoken, his voice cutting through the desert air like a verdict. Kane sneered. "You think one man can stop me? I own this county's gunslinger. The law rides with me." Colt didn't blink. "Then the law's bought and broken, and I don't answer." For a tense moment, the canyon held its breath. Then Kane's hand twitched toward his holster. His men followed, weapons flashing in the sunday. The standoff had begun. The canyon held its breath. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, every beat louder than the desert silence. Colt stood like stone, his rifle steady, while Kane's hand hovered near his holster. Dust swirled between them, catching the glint of steel. Then Kane sneered and barked a single word. "Take them!" Gunfire erupted, the canyon rang with thunder, bullets sparking against rock. Colt moved like a man carved from instinct, dropping low, firing fast, every shot deliberate. One of Kane's men toppled from his horse. Another clutched his side and fell screaming into the dirt. Eleanor crouched near the cabin wall, Colt's revolver clutched tight. Her breath came fast, but she remembered his words. Don't shoot, unless you mean it. She steadied her trembling hands, sighted on a rider charging toward Colt's flank, and pulled the trigger. The man cried out, his weapon tumbling from his grip as he toppled sideways. The recoil nearly knocked her back, but the sound of him hitting the ground filled her with a fierce jolt of strength. She wasn't prey anymore. Colt glanced her way once, a flicker of approval in his storm-gray eyes, before turning back to the fight. Kane's men pushed hard, trying to swarm them, but the narrow canyon worked against their numbers. Colt used every rock, every shadow, forcing them into lines where his rifle spoke with brutal efficiency. Still, bullets whined past, tearing into the wood of the cabin, shattering the lantern inside. Eleanor ducked, heart hammering, but forced herself to rise again. Through the haze of dust and smoke, she saw Kane himself, standing back from the fray, barking orders while his men bled for him. Rage burned in her chest, at the sight how easily he commanded others to do his violence while his own hands stayed clean. Another rider broke from the group, thundering straight toward her. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she lifted the revolver. This time her shot went wide, shattering the stone. The rider grinned cruelly, raising his pistol only to be dropped instantly by Colt's rifle. "Stay low!" Colt shouted, the urgency in his voice cutting through the chaos. The fight stretched long, dust choking the air, until finally the canyon floor was littered with groaning men and abandoned horses. Those still able to ride fled, dragging the wounded with them. Kane stood furious, his face red, before mounting his own horse. He pointed at Eleanor, his voice a venomous roar. "You're mine, girl. I'll burn this desert down to ash if I have to. You can't hide behind him forever." Then he wheeled his horse and vanished with the survivors into the distance, his threats echoing long after the hoofbeats faded. The sudden quiet rang louder than the gunfire. Eleanor lowered the revolver, her hands shaking violently now that the danger had passed. Colt approached, his rifle still in hand, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. "You did well," he said simply. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. "He won't stop, will he?" Colt shook his head. "No, not until one of us ends this." The truth hung heavy, but Eleanor no longer felt crushed by it. For the first time, she wanted to fight, not just to survive, but to claim her freedom. The canyon floor was quiet again, but Eleanor knew peace wouldn't last. Kane's retreat wasn't surrender, it was fury gathering strength. Every word he'd shouted before leaving clung to her skin like poison. That night, the fire burned low, as Colt cleaned his rifle with steady hands. Eleanor sat across from him, her revolver resting heavy in her lap. She wanted to ask if he thought they'd live through what was coming, but his expression told her enough. Kane would return, and when he did, it would be with more than hired guns. By dawn, her fear proved true. A rumble shook the earth, deeper than before. From the canyon rim, riders poured in twice the number from yesterday. At their head rode Kane, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 lawmen flanked him, badges glinting in the morning Sunday. Kane had twisted the law to his side, just as Colt predicted. "Eleanor Whitfield," one of the lawmen bellowed, "by order of the county, you're to be returned to your lawful husband, to be Bartholomew Kane." The words clawed at her chest. Lawful husband. The world itself seemed determined to chain her down. But when she looked at Colt, she saw no hesitation. He stepped forward, rifle at the ready, his voice carrying like iron. "She ain't his, and she never will be." The lawman scowled. "Stand aside, Colt. You don't want the county gunning for you." Colt's answer was simple. "The county already did. I'm still standing." The standoff stretched, the canyon thick with heat and tension. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears, but something shifted inside her. She was done hiding behind Colt's shadow. This was her fight, too. She stepped forward, revolver in hand, her voice clear, despite the tremor in her chest. "I am not property. I don't care what bargain was struck or what paper you wave in front of me. I won't go back. If you want me, Kane, you'll have to kill me first." The lawmen faltered, glancing at one another. It was one thing to drag a runaway bride back in chains. It was another to face down a woman standing armed, declaring her freedom. Kane's sneer twisted with rage. "You ungrateful girl! Do you know what you're throwing away? I gave your family land, cattle, security. You'd rather rot in the dirt with a broken gunslinger than live as my wife?" Eleanor's hand tightened on the revolver. "I'd rather rot free than live as your prisoner." The canyon exploded again with gunfire. Kane's men surged forward, but this time Eleanor stood her ground. She fired beside Colt, each shot steadier than the last. The lawmen hesitated, unwilling to die for Kane's greed. One by one, his men fell or fled, until only Kane remained, his suit stained with dust and fury. He raised his pistol, eyes blazing at Eleanor. Colt's rifle was steady, but Eleanor lifted her revolver first. Her voice rang out, sharp as the crack of thunder. "This ends now." Kane's pistol gleamed in the harsh sun, his finger tight on the trigger. Eleanor's breath caught, but she did not lower her revolver. For the first time in her life, she felt her fear bend to something stronger, and defiance. "Don't be foolish, girl," Kane growled. "You can't win this." Colt's rifle never wavered, his voice steady as stone. "She already has." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Kane jerked his weapon up, aiming square at Eleanor's chest. Before he could fire, 2 shots rang out, hers and Colt's, so close together they sounded like one. Kane staggered. Disbelief etched into his face. His pistol fell into the dirt. With a final curse swallowed by blood, he collapsed, the desert swallowing him in silence. The canyon was still, save for the cries of wounded men limping away. The lawmen, stripped of their false authority now that Kane was gone, turned their horses without a word, retreating under the weight of their own shame. Eleanor's revolver shook in her hand. She dropped it, chest heaving. Her knees threatened to buckle until Colt was beside her, steadying her with a firm grip. She looked up into his gray eyes, searching for judgment, but found only quiet respect. "You did it," he said softly. Her throat tightened. "We did it." The truth of it sank in as the dust settled. She was free, not bought, not owned, not promised to a man who would cage her, free because she had chosen to stand. They buried Kane beneath a cairn of stones, no marker save the silence of the desert. When it was done, Eleanor sat on a flat rock, staring at the endless horizon. Colt stood nearby, his hat low, as if waiting for her to decide what came next. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Colt took a long breath, his eyes on the land stretching wide. "Now, you live the life you want. No man can take that from you." The words settled deep in her chest. For so long, her life had been dictated by others. For the first time, the path ahead was hers to choose. She studied Colt, the man who had spoken so few words, yet offered her everything: safety, strength, freedom. "And you?" she asked quietly. He turned toward her, and the faintest trace of a smile tugged at his mouth. "I reckon I've been riding for a long time, with no reason to stop. Maybe that changes." Eleanor felt warmth bloom where fear had once lived. She stood, brushing dust from her dress, and met his gaze. "Then ride with me still. Not because I need saving, but because I don't want to face tomorrow without you." Colt tipped his hat, his silence saying more than any vow. Together they mounted his black horse, the desert stretching before them wide and wild. The sun dipped low, casting gold over the horizon as they rode side by side, not fugitives, not captor and captive, but equals stepping into a future no man had written for them. Eleanor was no longer the runaway bride. She was the woman who chose her own fate. And the silent gunslinger rode with her, not as her savior, but as her partner. If this story stirs you, just wait until you see the next tale, because love on the frontier is never simple, and every ending is only the start of another ride.